Well, thank you so much, Congressman, for those, for a great 30,000-foot view, as well as a view from the ground, from the trenches, from yourself, as you've said, having been a journalist from the beginning of your career and all along now, including with your columns. You brought up a lot of different threats to press freedom that we're facing right now. And the most obvious one is, on a daily basis, Donald Trump, both as a candidate and as president, has really hurled verbal abuse onto the entire press corps of the United States. And I would say it's not just assaults on press freedom, it really is abuse. And what it has done, of course, is chipped away at the view that Americans have of the Fourth Estate as a critical part of our democracy. And we at Poynter, I commissioned the first Poynter Media Trust Survey last year, and we found that a huge proportion of Americans, surprisingly, Trump supporters endorsed his view that journalists are the enemy of the people by great majorities. And they also, surprisingly, across the board, we saw that 25% of people we surveyed endorsed some of the most draconian things he has suggested against the press, like censoring stories, the government having the right to withhold stories that it doesn't like, that he considers negative. And remember, he calls anything fake news that he doesn't like. It doesn't mean it's fake. And all sorts of other kinds of controls on the press. So in that landscape, including with last week, we saw the Justice Department having seized a journalist's, years of a journalist's phone and email records to go after leakers, which is another threat to the confidentiality of sources. What do you see as the single greatest threat to press freedom right now that Americans, ordinary citizens, and the press ourselves need to wake up about and do something about?
Well, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. One is that those people, I belong to a group with it. We have a little pin. I didn't wear it today. Yash is in it too. That is a coalition of the democratic forces, and it's people who are going to much more aggressively start carrying the message of what a free society requires, of not only the press, but free dialogue, deliberation, listening to each other. There are a lot of ways that we ourselves need to, when we hear nonsense, speak up about it. Not too much silence is, it's very polite, but it's going to kill us. But there's a different problem here, and that is one thing that we learned after the election, which we should have learned long before, is how many people in America really are ripe for the try to escape freedom, as Eric Fromm put it, because there are so many areas where the great economic advances and profits that the country is making, and our GDP is great and all that. That doesn't matter if you're struggling. There's a lot of attention to the wrong end. There's a lot of attention to the 1% and the inequality. The inequality is not the problem. People who are poor, because I was one when I grew up, people that are poor don't envy and hate the people who are rich. The problem is that the people at the bottom don't have enough. They don't have sufficiency. They can't be sure that they can pay for their doctor bills or get their car repaired if it gets broken. And so one of the things that we have to pay more attention to is what's feeding the discontent and the anger, so that people are shutting out truth because anybody who promises you're going to fix it. What is the immigration thing? Keep out anybody who's going to challenge us and take our jobs. That's not all. I mean, Trump is a tyrant. There's I'm not playing that down. But we also simultaneously have to pay attention to the areas in which so much of America is suffering and hurting. Like the people who were part of Black Lives Matter. Those are problems that have to be addressed. And so there are reasons people are angry.
So then the question is, if we turn the focus from the general public onto the press ourselves, what should we be doing to defend our own rights, right? Because nobody is going to defend them for us, it looks like. We have a situation where the president, according to the Washington Post fact-checker count, has lied more than 3,000 times in the 400-plus days since he took office.
Those are just the ones we've caught.
Well, those are the ones that the Post has counted. Some other news organizations have a much more conservative count, but in any case, it's indisputable that he has spouted a lot of lies and misinformation. But we also know from linguists like George Lakoff and others that once misinformation is encoded into our brains, it's very hard to change that perception. People believe the lies. And so my question to you is, even sometimes corrections and fact checks have the effect, social science research has shown, of reinforcing the original lie. So what are journalists to do to try to hold the government accountable and the president for untrue statements?
Well, it wasn't just George Lakoff, it was Goebbels, too. He said exactly the same thing. What we have to do is stop following the tweets, because the president, we are the megaphone. The president says something and we make sure that there's nobody who didn't hear it. I think if we stick to just the facts of the developing stories, the issues, what's happening at the border, and let's tune the president out a little bit. Let's not give him a megaphone. Let's not magnify what he says. Let's let his tweets go into wherever they go and pay no attention to them. It's not true that everything he says must be reported because he's the president. No, he's a fat toad. I mean, give me a break. We don't need to report blindly everything this idiot says. And that's what we have to do. We have to, as journalists, have to stick to what's the news, what are the facts, what do people need to know, and not just follow all this. He is jerking us around. It's just ridiculous. And so the answer to quickly, what does the press need to do? Self-restraint, forbearance. Just don't go chasing after every car.
It's interesting you say that. I can say that as someone, who has worked in so many newsrooms. Editors will tell you, of course you're not a transcriber. We're not a transcription service, but we do go to White House press briefings and we do go to State Department press briefings and the like, and we do report what authorities say because that is our system, that we hold people accountable by saying what they say. I thought it was very interesting to see recently Margaret Sullivan of the Washington Post, the media columnist, sort of played off of what George Lakoff was saying and said we should have a truth sandwich, where you say the true statement first, then you say what the president said, and then you return to the true statement. I thought it was interesting how just the other day, when the president reversed his own horrific policy about separations of children from their parents at the border, so many news outlets in their initial headlines said, "President stops family separations," without stating in the headline that actually he was the one who created the crisis. So there are better ways to write headlines, there are better ways to tell stories for sure, but I'm not sure that it's realistic, as someone who spent the last 10 years in Washington, to tell us that we shouldn't report on what the president says, but maybe we need to report on it in a smarter way.
Well, I could actually see a reporter coming out of a press conference with Sarah Huckabee Sanders and just coming back and said, nothing new was said. And I'm quite serious about this. There are things that because of his position, the president says, that need to be reported because they are policy. They affect public policy, and we need to know about that. But a lot of the other stuff that is reported about his comments, his opinions, and all, don't need magnification. So part of it is, one of your jobs as a reporter may be to write, but one of your jobs as an editor is to prioritize and to decide what's really news, what isn't really news, to say, we're going to put that in 3 paragraphs on page 27. So there needs to be more of that. Just not getting carried away. We've always had this habit that every time a president sneezes, we have to report it. And I think Donald Trump causes us to rethink some of that approach to how we report.
The NYU press scholar Jay Rosen has, sort of endorsed your view of saying you could come out of a Sarah Huckabee Sanders briefing and say nothing happened, there's no news, because his approach is send the interns so that they're there in case something amazing happens, but have the really experienced White House reporters actually sniffing out other stories, telling the story that we're not finding out about. Now, the reality is that Donald Trump has a very long history with the press, and he knows how to use the press to his advantage. We discovered not long ago from the original reporter researcher on the first Forbes 400 list that he acknowledges now that he was duped by Donald Trump into putting him on the first Forbes 400 richest people list, when in fact Trump did not deserve to be. That reporter, Jonathan Greenberg, acknowledges now in retrospect that he didn't realize at the time he was a 22-year-old new employee at Forbes, but that Trump was vastly inflating his wealth by several digits, and then pretended to be a spokesman and called, speaking about Trump, pretending to be a spokesman. I feel that Donald Trump, this is this John Barron character who he invented and used over the years many times. I think that the reason Trump treats the press so badly is because he doesn't respect the press. He saw what he could get away with starting in the 1980s in New York. And it makes me think about how you said we were all laughing at Kellyanne Conway and her use of the term alternative facts. I wasn't laughing. I felt it was incredibly canny and calculated, in the same way that it was incredibly calculated that Donald Trump seized on the term fake news, which meant something entirely different, and reversed it and weaponized it and directed against the press. So my question to you is, you've not just been a reporter, you've actually been in Congress for 16 years. Why are members of Congress not standing up and doing something about this when they can plainly see the lies and the cynicism?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons, and I completely agree with you, and nobody's more critical of the current Congress than I am. One of the reasons for it is lack of courage. One of the things that I love about, sometimes it sounds like I'm braggy, because I will, in a lot of public forums, and especially when there are people from the Hill there, I will talk about, that I've been a columnist for all these papers and had an NPR program, and I've written all these books, and I got elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I've done all this stuff. And my point is, that was after I left Congress. The world doesn't end if you don't be a coward. Don't cling to your job. Do what you have to do. You took an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution. And if you lose your seat in Congress because you did that, then life goes on. Do something else. So that's part of it. But there is another part. I wasn't joking before when I said I'm writing a book about getting rid of political parties, having nonpartisan elections, nonpartisan governing systems, which is what the founders told us to do. The part of the problem, and this is true in Pennsylvania as everywhere else, if you are running for office and you run in a primary, and the people who show up in the primary, who are the most hardline on whichever party you're in, who are the most uncompromising, the most zealous, who are the most punishing of people who are compromising and collegial and so forth, whoever wins the primary gets to be the only person in their party on the ballot in November. So if you're a member of Congress today or of the Pennsylvania legislature, what you worry about is, who cares about all these voters? What you're Your future depends on those who vote in a primary. So they're not crazy. This is our political system. None of you will ever go out and do something which you know is going to cause you to lose your job. Well, they're no different. And until we change our political system, none of this is going to change.
It's a long laundry list of things to do. Get rid of the Electoral College, get rid of parties, change the system. You're absolutely right that getting primaried out of your seat, the fact that it is the extremes of both parties that to whom, primary voters appeal to that, the base, there's no question. I can see it as being a long list, and I wonder how long it will take. Let me ask you to close with this thought. The press coverage and the print media coverage of the horror show at the border, with children being ripped away from their parents down to babies being ripped away from a mother who was breastfeeding, that essentially forced the president's hand to undo a policy that he had endorsed, that his own White House had created. We did not see the same thing happen with the coverage of Puerto Rico. And I wonder at what point, the press has a moral obligation, Congress has a moral obligation to stand up when there are things like this that happen. At the other hand, there's outrage fatigue. You can't, every single day there's another outrage that's happening, and I think the public can't keep them all in their head, and the press probably can't either. So how do we cover things in a way that doesn't exhaust people and gets the most important things done? And wouldn't it have been nice if there had been more coverage of Puerto Rico that could have affected that situation?
Oh, absolutely. And you can't stay outraged every minute, although this guy's putting us to the test, because I'm pretty outraged every minute. But part of it is what I was saying before. Let's look at the things and prioritize the things that are really outrageous. Unless Stormy Daniels was really a red sparrow who was put there by the Soviets, forget her. Because one reason is because the press has magnified everything possible into a big story. And therefore, people get exhausted by it, and the press gets exhausted by it. That's what the job of editors is for. Pick what's the real news, the important stuff, and focus on it, and so that you have the energy when the real outrages, like Puerto Rico, like the shootings, like the again, it's every day. It's the border cases, so that we can really give full attention to that and drive home to people how this is not the norm. By the press chasing every tweet and every story it can, we are making it the norm. We have to stop helping him.
Mm-hmm. All right, so one last pithy thought that I want from you.
I don't do pithy. I'm a politician. What?
Well, wise. Give us some short wise. You were a Republican congressman, and we look at the figures of Republicans greatly distrust the press now. We're talking in the 70% distrust the press. What is your one piece of advice as a journalist and a Republican to what should the press be doing to restore public trust in what we do? Is it about explaining our process? What do we need to do to get people, especially Republicans, to trust us again?
Well, that's hard to do pithy, so very quickly. I learned in journalism school that you don't put opinion and commentary in a news story. There's lots of places, lots of columns, lots of opinion pieces. It could be on the front page, it could be anywhere. But it has become commonplace now, out of our frustration, to pick up a news story and read it, and it's full of opinion. And that causes people who read it to, decide that the press is just pushing an agenda. That's a problem. I think we need. So I am a Republican. That's kind of shaky at the moment, but because I'm a Republican, I remember that as evil as Trump is, and I agree that he is, I am hearing the same criticisms that I heard of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, and there have been so many, that it starts to say, this is just attacks on people who think differently than we do. So I think the press needs to be careful about making sure that we look at Trump as something different, something that this is not, just part of who those people are. But I think mainly, so the Times has started doing this page 2 thing, where they explain how they do their stories, how they go through the process. I think more of that, more openness would be really good. Here's how we sit these reporters down. Here's who they interviewed. Here's who they talked to. Here's where they dug into. So if there is more disclosure, more transparency about how this news was gathered and these facts were found, that would help. So people aren't just saying, oh, they've just stated an opinion, but oh, wow, they really have a basis for this. I think that would help.
Great advice. I hope we all follow it. You're preaching to the choir with me. I'm an evangelist for transparency about process. Thank you so much, former Congressman Mickey Edwards.